Imagine waking up to find that a piece of federal gun law most people assumed would never change has suddenly been rewritten, and not in your favor, not next year, not after some long transition period, today. The kind of change that instantly throws millions of gun owners, builders, buyers, dealers, and even people who were simply planning their next purchase into total uncertainty, because that is exactly why this issue matters so much right now. Congress has now approved a move tied directly to NFA regulation and short-barreled rifles, and the fallout is already sending shockwaves through the entire firearms community. For years, the federal government treated SBRs as a special class of firearms under the National Firearms Act, wrapping them in taxes, paperwork, registration, and criminal penalties. It was already a system that many argued made no constitutional sense. But now, instead of creating clarity, what has happened is creating a new level of confusion, pressure, and potential legal conflict that could impact millions of Americans immediately. And that is the part many headlines miss. This is not just some technical legislative tweak buried inside a larger bill that only policy nerds care about. This is the kind of change that reaches straight into the everyday decisions of ordinary gun owners. It affects what you can buy, how you configure a rifle, what legal risks you may face, what states may try next, and how aggressively future litigation's going to move. In other words, this is not abstract. This is personal. If you own firearms, if you care about the Second Amendment, or if you simply pay attention to the way government power expands one category at a time, this development deserves your full attention. What makes this moment even more important is the contrast between what should be happening and what so often does happen in Washington. If lawmakers were serious about respecting constitutional rights, they would be rolling back irrational restrictions that punish peaceable citizens for owning commonly used arms. They would be eliminating arbitrary distinctions that turn inches of barrel length into felony territory. They would be admitting that the NFA framework has always rested on shaky constitutional and historical ground. But instead of a clean restoration of rights, what the country gets is a new political and legal mess, one that leaves gun owners asking the same question they always end up asking: what exactly did Congress just do? And how is it going to be enforced? That question matters, because in federal gun law, the distance between a supposed reform and a practical trap can be very small. We have seen this before. A measure gets passed. Politicians claim they solved a problem. Agencies start interpreting the language. States begin reacting. And average citizens are left trying to figure out whether they just became more free or more exposed. That is why today we are going to break this down carefully, because the details matter, the timing matters, and the real-world consequences matter even more. At the center of all of this is the long-running fight over SBRs and NFA classifications. And the government has spent decades pretending that a rifle with a shorter barrel belongs in some uniquely dangerous legal category that justifies special registration and federal control. Yet the historical case for that has always been weak, and the constitutional case looks even weaker after modern Second Amendment rulings. Common use, text, history, tradition, all of those principles create serious problems for broad restrictions on arms possessed for lawful purposes. That is why every move involving the NFA now carries bigger implications than it used to. It is no longer just about bureaucracy. It is about whether the government can keep defending these categories at all. And here is where the stakes get even higher. Once Congress touches this area, whether by changing tax treatment, redefining enforcement, or signaling new policy direction, it does not just affect one subclass of firearms. It changes the battlefield. It shapes future court challenges. It influences how states justify their own bans. It affects whether anti-gun officials think they can press further, or whether gun rights groups see an opening to strike harder. So when people hear that Congress has approved a major NFA and SBR related move, they should not think of this as an isolated event. They should see it for what it really is, a trigger point for a much larger legal and political confrontation that starts now, not later. And if you are sensing that the people in power are counting on confusion, you are probably right, because confusion is useful. Confusion slows public response. Confusion gives agencies room to maneuver. Confusion lets hostile states test the limits, and confusion causes many otherwise law-abiding Americans to hold back, comply unnecessarily, or make expensive decisions based on fear rather than facts. That is why the most important thing right now is not panic. It is clarity. What changed, who is affected, what comes next, and where the biggest risks and opportunities actually are. That is what we need to sort out, because the story here is bigger than a headline and more serious than a talking point. Say the word and I'll give you the next section. What Congress has approved is being framed by many as a decisive NFA and SBR moment. And the reason millions are impacted today is not just because of the text itself, but because of what that text sets into motion. When federal law changes around a regulated category like short-barreled rifles, the immediate effect is uncertainty, but the deeper effect is strategic. Supporters of gun rights see an opening to challenge the entire premise of NFA treatment. Opponents of gun rights see an opportunity to harden state restrictions, drag out litigation, and claim that federal action somehow validates local bans. So the real battle is not only over what Congress did, it is over who gets to define what it means. If you look at the pattern, it becomes clear very quickly. Whenever a restriction starts looking vulnerable under the Constitution, government actors often stop defending the principle and start defending the process. They delay, they divert, they hide behind procedure, they ask for more time, more studies, more discovery, more agency review, anything except a direct answer to the central question. And that central question here is simple. Why should an otherwise ordinary firearm become subject to extraordinary federal control because of barrel length? That question has never had a satisfying constitutional answer. It has only had a long history of bureaucratic habit and political inertia. That is why this congressional move matters far beyond the chamber where it passed. The minute lawmakers alter the NFA landscape. They expose just how artificial the old framework was. If one part can be changed this quickly, then the public starts asking why the rest exists at all. If the government can reduce a tax, revise treatment, or rework classifications through legislation, then claims that these rules were somehow untouchable begin to collapse. And once that happens, every pending challenge to SBR restrictions gains new energy. Every state-level ban looks more vulnerable. Every official trying to defend old prohibitions has a harder time pretending this is just settled law. Now, to be clear, that does not mean freedom automatically expands overnight. In fact, this is exactly the kind of moment when rights can either advance or get tangled in a new web of compliance demands. Federal action can create relief in one area while triggering resistance in another. Anti-gun states may respond by doubling down. Agencies may issue guidance that muddies the water. Courts may be asked to interpret overlapping rules that were never drafted with clarity in mind. And that means millions of Americans are impacted, not merely because they own SBRs, but because they live under a legal system where every supposed reform can become another fight. That contrast is the heart of the story. On one side, you have the plain constitutional principle that law-abiding citizens do not lose their rights because the government dislikes a firearm configuration. On the other side, you have a political machine that keeps trying to preserve power through labels, categories, and delay tactics. One side says common arms are protected. The other says this arm is different, this feature is dangerous, this subclass is special, this citizen must register, this transfer must be taxed, this possession must be monitored. It is the same old formula, just dressed up in updated language. And the public is starting to see through it, because when Congress acts in this area, intentionally or not, it highlights how unstable the anti-gun position really is. If SBRs are supposedly so uniquely dangerous, why does the argument always lean on administrative structure instead of historical tradition? Why do defenders of these laws so often talk around the constitutional issue instead of through it? Why does the debate so quickly shift from public safety rhetoric to procedural stalling the moment serious litigation begins? The answer is obvious. The foundation is weak and everyone in power knows it. That is also why millions are watching this so closely today. Dealers are watching, manufacturers are watching, gun owners are watching, lawyers are watching, state governments are watching, because everybody understands that once Congress touches a fault line in federal gun law, pressure starts moving in every direction. Some will try to use this moment to restore rights. Others will try to exploit it to preserve control. And ordinary Americans will once again be forced to navigate a legal environment where the people claiming to protect democracy are often the same people making basic constitutional rights harder to exercise. So where does that leave us right now? It leaves us in the most dangerous kind of legal moment, one where the implications are enormous, but the messaging is intentionally muddy. That is why people need to focus less on polished political statements and more on actual effect. What can be enforced now? What categories remain vulnerable? Which challenges become stronger? Which states are likely to resist? And how fast will courts be forced to confront the contradictions that Congress has now helped expose? Those are the questions that matter, and they are the questions that will determine whether this becomes a turning point for gun rights or another chapter in the government's long strategy of controlled confusion. The good news is that confusion does not last forever. Courts eventually have to rule. Officials eventually have to defend their positions. And once they do, the distance between constitutional principle and political maneuvering becomes impossible to hide. That is where this is heading next. The real fight begins when governments are forced to stop talking about process and finally justify substance. And that is exactly where the pressure is now building. We are at 1,600 words, so I'll stop here.